Okay, welcome to everyone. Thank you so much that you have found the time to join us today. I'm Dr. Stefanie Lemke, and together with my colleague, Dr. Cong-rui, I'm organizing the Human Rights and Rule of Law Speaker Series, EnRoL. EnRoL is a webinar series, and every 2 months we bring together 2 female role models, practitioners and scholars discussing rule of law and human rights matters. Today's topic is rule of law developments in Central Asia. The reason for this is that, while at least here in Western Europe, mainstream media widely cover the rule of law situation in Poland, Russia, Hungary, we don't hear much about the situation in Central Asia. Recently, in Kazakhstan, there was some unrest. Protests were sparked by rising food prices, which then turned into a general protest against poverty, inequality, and corruption in Kazakhstan. And this is why today, we have invited 2 experts on Central Asia, Dr. Anja Mihr. Anja Mihr is an associate professor at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. And she is also program director and the founder of the Humboldt Viadrina Center on Governance through Human Rights. Welcome, Anja. And we also have the Tajik human rights lawyer Farangis Zikriyaeva with us. She's a co-founder of the NGO Human Rights Matter, and also a senior research fellow at the European University Viadrina at Frankfurt Oder in Germany. Also a warm welcome to you, Farangis. So what we will do in the following, we will have 2 presentations, which will be then followed by a brief discussion by my colleague Zhao. And then we will open the floor to you for your questions and comments. So I would then hand over to my colleague Anja. Anja will present on democratic institution building in Central Asia, the situation of Kyrgyzstan. Anja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I have to actually do the presentation, not from I should start from the beginning. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I was told to be short. I try to be, and I try to work with visuals. I'm sure most of the people who join us today are somewhat familiar with Central Asia. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have joined. Others are very curious and maybe have Googled it before and know where more or less it is between Eastern Europe or Central Europe and what then is probably East Asia and China. And it's somewhere in the middle of Eurasia. Just one student yesterday told me, a Kyrgyz student, that we are the center of the world here in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and I cannot more than agree with him. Geographically, it is pretty much in the center of Eurasia. So Central Asia, as you can see here on the map that I brought for you, and the map plays a role now in this short talk that I will give to put Central Asia on the plate, and why it is so important, or increasingly important also for European politics, for certainly for China's politics. It is what they often call, or Central Asia, the corridor, the countries, the area of connectivity. And these are terms that we have heard more and more over the past 10 years, particularly since the 2013 launch of the Belt and Road Initiative by China. The Belt and Road Initiative by China, often in Europe called the Silk Road Project or the New Silk Road Project, goes through almost all Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan in particular. This is where the main road goes, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan partly, certainly Uzbekistan, and also partially Turkmenistan, but also Afghanistan. And I'm highlighting this here because it plays an increasing role also when we talk about democratic institution building, or what is more known nowadays as backsliding of democratic institution. And that is actually where I will focus on. So bearing the map in mind, What I would like to look at, or just briefly describe what kind of sectors we're actually talking when we talk about backsliding of democracy and rule of law in Central Asia. There is, for once, the governance sector of security. We've just, Stephanie just highlighted the fact of the unrest in Kazakhstan, where we have for the first time seen, and from probably many Europeans, they weren't aware of it, that they have something like a security alliance here in Central Asia with Russia, with the former hegemon. Some would say here with the former colonist. It's a matter of taste how you describe it, but the former hegemon in the region. And I was asked many times in Germany, my home country, where I also sometimes give some talks on this issue, whether this is equivalent to what the NATO, probably you could call it an equivalent security alliance. Also in terms of economic or the economy, the development, democracy in general, when we think about elections. But one thing I like to highlight in particular is the state sovereignty, which is currently here in Central Asia dramatically under attack, you could say. Sovereignty, state sovereignty is or the states are losing sovereignty almost on a daily basis. When you look on these different sectors, and you look on how transparent, how accountable these sectors actually have worked over the past years, how participatory democracy was, the sovereignty, the judiciary, you can see a steady decline. And I think my colleague will talk more in detail later about equality, inclusiveness, and in particular about the legal part and what we've seen all in the region. I have brought you some figures. I will explain. These are the white figures, the numbers that you see here. I just looked at 3 countries because we will hear more about Tajikistan, just to give you a little bit of a comparison where we're standing here in Central Asia. We have the big country that most of us are familiar with is Kazakhstan. When you look at the white numbers that I put in the spot of Kazakhstan, the first comes from the rule of law index, the annual index, where you compare the regions, the different countries within the regions. Central Asian countries or Eurasian countries often there are 14 or 13 countries, including the Central Asian countries, but also like Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, Moldova, etc. Kazakhstan scores 4 out of 14 countries in terms of rule of law performance, and hasn't changed much since around 2018. I took 18 as a benchmark because that is where we have seen all over the world also sort of a peak in populism and the first peak in backsliding of democratic institution performance. So simply just as an indicator, this is not rocket science, what I'm presenting here, just to show you where we are standing. Backsliding started earlier, but in 2018 we had the first peak, and now it's getting even more down steadily. I also took as a comparison the Bertelsmann Transformation Index that in particular looks at political transformation, also economic transformation, also trying to compare these the 2 figures just the last 3-4 years. 2018 Kazakhstan 4.7, but then there was a interesting transition, basically not a non-democratic transition of leaders passing one to the other. So the political transformation went down to 3.78. Everything below 5 points, by the way, is very low already. So even in the very low scales, Kazakhstan has even lost points, and I'm sure in the next index it's going even further down. I have another example here, Uzbekistan, because from what I follow in the media and in the debates, particularly in Europe, Uzbekistan is a new actor in this game because it has opened up 4 or 5 years ago with a new president they had and elections. They had massive reforms, economic reforms in particular, and is sort of seen often as a hope the case of hope for opening and democratization in the region. But when we look at the figures, this political transformation actually has not taken place significantly, and the economic transformation has. So here the rule of law index, Kazakhstan is scoring a little bit better because it has made massive legal reforms. 10 out of 14 countries, it was worse in 2018. In terms of political transformation, you see here it's a 3.6 versus a 3.1, not significantly improved. And then last but not least, Kyrgyzstan, the smallest country in the region, often known as the Switzerland of Central Asia, the only democracy in Central Asia, and so on. But when we take a closer look at it, it has lost massive grounds over the past years, also due to the fact that there has been not really a democratic transition of leadership, and instead it has been backsliding. Of all the countries, it has been backsliding in terms of democratic performance most dramatically. The rule of law, in 2018, Kyrgyzstan was on position 10 out of 30. Now it's on 12 out of 14. It is dramatically going down. So being 14 from 14, you would be the last one. I can tell you in comparison, the country in this group of countries that is compared, that scores usually better, is Georgia. And we already know that Georgia has issues with the rule of law. So you can imagine that how dramatic that is. In terms of democratic or political transformation, it has been, according to the 2020 figures, similar. However, then something happened in 2020. Also, you can blame it on the pandemic, but not only in the pandemic. What we have seen during the pandemic happening here in Central Asia was sort of just kind of a speeding up a process that was already going on in terms of backsliding democratic institutions, but it sort of accumulated in 2020. After the parliamentarian elections in October 2020, where basically a coup happened and the elections were annulled. And to make a long story short, instead of having new elections on the parliament, they just installed new elections of the president, very dubious. They freed a former prisoner, Shaparov, who now is president, and then he kind of declared himself president, and then later in 2021 had elections. So these kind of civil unrests and very, let's say, a different way of transforming also political power and leadership has certainly weakened the countries, has weakened the trust in democratic institutions. And I want to give you some more concrete reasons for it, why I think that is the case. But before I move on to the next slide, which is basically also my last slide with some of the reasonings here, I want you to again picture where Kyrgyzstan is. It has a long border with China. It's further away from Russia than it is actually from China. If I now here in Bishkek, if I take the car, I'm at 3-4 hours, I will be at the Chinese border. So it's very close. And China has massive interest in the region, not only because of the Belt and Road, but also historically, and it is present everywhere. What could be some of the reasons for democratic backsliding and the dismantling of statehood? I would go as far as that. You have seen the scores by the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, by the Rule of Law Index. None of these Central Asian countries, and I only took 3 that already do a little bit better than the other 2, Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. So if I even take Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, already they score around 5, below 5, so not even the minimum standards in terms of democratic performance, what you could call a consolidated, a strong democracy. At the most, you could have called Kyrgyzstan maybe an electoral democracy. Now it is rather it's an authoritarian, maybe a competitive authoritarian regime, but certainly not a democracy. What comes to everybody's attention when you read the literature, when you look at the data, when you look at what happened over the past 5 to 10 years, you see there were a number of constitutional reforms, not only in Kyrgyzstan, all around the place, which were basically non-democratic by its nature, shrinking not only civic space, we will hear about that more, but also constitutional freedoms of people. And last year, something happened here in Kyrgyzstan with a constitutional reform that probably nobody expected. The constitution basically dismantled and abolished the parliament, the main legislative power in the countries, the powers that actually make the laws, by installing a new body, a consultative body. It's a council of elderly men. Apart from that, we can also talk about patriarchy here, but it was almost unseen also by the OSCE. So there wasn't a de jure abolishment of the parliament, but a de facto abolishment of the parliament. Very interesting and very sad to see that. The non-democratic transition of the leaders by either passing on to between elections to the next one, or in the case what we have seen in Kyrgyzstan, basically through a coup. Establishment of organized crime, something that I personally, when I have these debates in Europe, that is often underestimated. Just to give you an idea, 70% of the parliamentarians in the Kyrgyz parliament are so-called businessmen. Those who work in the organized crime field know that in many countries where organized crime are de facto ruling the countries, begging or financing political leaders, they are called businessmen. They call themselves that way. And here, it's not the question is not whether they exist or not. The question is, have they established themselves in the democratic institutions? And yes, they have. Chinese Belt and Road Initiative plays a huge role here in terms of dependency of the country, also on Chinese investments. I can later maybe talk, I don't want to extend this too much. There is a massive brain drain, not only to the West of the young, let's say the civil society, the young elites, the well-educated, but also to the East. China has, over the last years, as part of the Belt and Road, massively invested, not in education in the country, but in terms of scholarships. So many of our students that even here at the academy, after they finish the academy, they receive a scholarship to go to China for further studies. That is not uncommon. It's becoming more and more the rule. Something that is underestimated yet also I would say from a Western perspective, what role that plays. Shrinking space, as I said, we will hear more about this. I would also highlight the fact of the social media. The social media here, particularly YouTube, Facebook, is the only often means of information. And there is absolutely no control over social media here and over hate speech that has, and we cannot ignore it, a massive impact on how people perceive also democratic leadership. And last but not least, I want to highlight that these countries here in Central Asia and also foremost Kyrgyzstan are member of a regional organization and more active members. And these regional organization, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation or the Security Treaty Organization, the mini NATO here in Central Asia, and the former Soviet states, they have either China as leading these organizations or Russia. And we should also bear in mind that these both countries are not democratically led and of course have a certain influence on the way to govern. I leave it here. This is just some food for thought. I'm looking forward also to hear my colleague on this, but I want to finish actually with one picture because I really like the region and the atmosphere. Thank you very much.
Beautiful photo. Thank you so much for your presentation, Anja. I will then hand over to my colleague Farangis Zikriyaeva, and she will present on the situation of human rights defenders in Central Asia, the example of Tajikistan. Farah, the floor is yours.
First of all, hello everyone. Very happy to read your names and see your photos and so on, yes, on and not. But first of all, I want to thank you both, Cong-rui and Stephanie, for EnRoL. And thank you for enrolling me to today's discussion. That's really awesome. And especially like, I love women-led initiatives. Wonderful. So yeah, I will be pretty fast now. Consider that it's only 15 minutes to talk about Tajikistan and talk about, yes, specific group of people. So, Anja gave really within a short, she had the toughest, I think, the most toughest task and comparison with mine to give the overview of the whole Central Asia, very, very concise, very in point, and those I agree with certain aspects you raised, especially organized crime. Yes, we do underestimate this thing. Because I think I will, during my presentation, you will sort of, it's not organized crime, but see the companies, how they can also affect the situation with human rights defenders in Tajikistan. So let's go. I was thinking long, like how to start the presentation, because I wanted to kind of like to narrow down a little bit, but go a little bit more deeper about those people who are in Tajikistan and working under very limited space conditions. And one of the, I mean, it's only part of the civil society in Tajikistan, it's human rights organizations. And I put human rights advocates and defenders as a second group. I will explain now why, because actually, human rights activism, it gets in certain form, and majority of human rights activists, I'm not talking about like bloggers, they kind of independently do, journalists, they're working either independently or work with the mass media institute, like institutional firms or whatever, like establishment. And majority of the defenders or activists, human rights activists, they get the form of the human rights organizations, which is, legally speaking, that's under the law of Tajikistan, it's a public associations. So, and we have those like activists who are working either as a member of the human rights organization, or they work independently as a, let's say, in a different forms like consultancy, or just as an active people who are engaged in certain activities. And we have advocates. Advocates, it's not exactly like defenders, but advocates, I used it instead of using the term practicing lawyers. So advocates, it's those who has a right to practice law in Tajikistan. So I would like to talk about this kind of like two categories I brought here as human rights organization, human rights advocates, defenders. And I think you will see the logic of me to make these two categories. And I think I would like to start with the challenges, what they have. But before going this, I would make like a little bit historical background. I think we talked before starting this talk about what happened like 10, 15 years ago. And definitely Tajikistan is the only country in Central Asia. And that's really good that it's only country where the civil war, in comparison with other countries of post-Soviet, let's say, territory. And definitely the developments of the public association and activists started pretty much a little bit later. So the new, like the first organization started registration in 1996, 1997. And we know that the peace accord was signed in 1997. So, and then the post-conflict times have started. So at that point, the freedom was wider because it kind of was new phenomenon. It's kind of something new came, and actually the state, the country was pretty much busy with making the peace and with establishing the institution, and like additional help that was really like kind of welcomed. But in 2006, and I just can say on my experience working with the organization by then in 2006, I personally started to feel that something's going going on with making certain limitations, more kind of observations, more control, and more making the obstacles. And I think the 2006 and 2007, it's exactly that moment when when we use now word shrinking has started with Tajik civil society in general, but mostly with the human rights organizations and human rights defenders. So let's jump to the challenges. As you see, like human rights organization have the challenges, which is actually also the challenges for human rights advocates, because as I said, majority of them, they are members or like members of those organizations and they're leaders and in a kind of managerial level. So human rights organizations constantly actually started to face registration aspects. The thing is, the law has been several times have been changed about public associations, and it's very complicated to register organization which has human rights mission, let's say, or vision, or any kind of tasks. So it's kind of not possible to do this. So that's why in my experience, we were not able to register one of the organizations who had human rights or democracy or rule of law even tasks. Re-registration, what does it mean, re-registration? And I have office in Dushanbe, and I want to move to Khujand, with north part of Tajikistan. Then you have to go through re-registration, the same procedure as you do registration. So it's kind of like, as you see, obstacles are built in a different kind of levels. These obstacles made by law. And then another thing also made by law, it's inspection and audit. It's also very hectic. It's we talk about de jure and de facto. De jure, yes, we have this inspection audit, and then de facto, it's not following the law. And I mean, in itself, law, it's very like creating a lot of obstacles and limitation. And on top of it, you get the de facto limitation obstacles. So by the end of audit, you should receive the report, but not all organizations receive that report. So you don't know what's going on actually with you, and what the fate of the organization. And other things now, the whole organization has to submit the programmatic and financial report, very detailed, every year by first. If I don't make a mistake, by 1st of April, you have to do this. And another kind of difficult security agency meetings. They're very, let's say it's nasty to have those meetings. Why? As soon as you get the information, hey, could you please come just to have a meeting? It's just friendly meeting. But definitely security agency has been always the institution of a fear. It's came from the history, and definitely people do not feel safe about this, and it's psychological effect. So it happens there. And then propaganda of antipathy. I meant by I'm not sure if it's kind of clear, but what I want to say, lately, what I have started to observe in social media is about saying that the human rights organization, public association, they are getting the grants, and they grant eaters, let's say. So it's kind of say, yeah, they get grant or what they do. And it's sometimes it happens. It's kind of like sometimes it becomes very silent, and then it comes back again. So you can see those kind of things that to make less trust to public associations, to the human rights organizations, and to ask, what do you do with those money? What kind of work you do? And liquidation. Liquidation, it's kind of the last resort that the state use liquidation when they see that organizations working with too sensitive issue. There are several kind of examples of it. I will not consider that it's a short presentation. I will not stop it, but you definitely can Google and find those organizations has been liquidated. And this is in terms of the organization, how the organization can be treated and threatened or intimidated. This is how the law is used against the human rights organizations, or can be used against the human rights organizations in order to limit their work. Human rights defenders, yes, as I said, the most of kind of the members of human rights organization, definitely they kind of have all those problems, but they also can have the kind of, as an individual, have also the problem of threatening and intimidation, or some warnings of that you're going too far and you should be kind of careful with what you do. And advocates, it's a practice in lawyers, it's an interesting thing with them is that practicing human rights advocates, they are the only people who go to the court. So human rights organizations work on the human rights issues, definitely advocacy, petition, writing reports, conducting trainings, raising awareness, and a lot of kind of methods. And advocates is those who go to the court. And here is actually the biggest problem for this category. I mean, what these people is that if the members also of human rights organizations, they face these organizational difficulties, but at the same time, they have a lot of difficulties in the practice, in the connection with the prosecutor office, with the judiciary. As I wrote, lack of independence in 2015, that was again, by the way, law. Law, it's pretty much easy to do in Tajikistan. So because yeah, I mean, the society does not have any influence to this, and the draft laws are not published often, and there is no any discussions of the law. So the law in 2015 definitely make a lot of changes in the independence of the Bar Association. So in 2015, Minister of Justice became the member of the qualification exam, and as soon as the new law adopted, then there is a the examination, the qualification exam has been conducted, and we in Tajikistan had more than 2,000 advocates, I mean, practice lawyers, and now we have about 800. So as you see that it raised the problem of legal aid, its accessibility to legal aid, and these institutions became quite weak, as it's pretty much a very dramatic decrease. It's a trumped up charges, also very depend on what kind of sensitive issues human rights advocates are working about. And I will bring on my next slide, you will see one of the example of one of the case, and you can kind of see in detail what's kind of happening with, what can happen with the human rights advocates when those have like the connection with the state or the private companies. And you will see we don't talk a lot lately like about the private companies, but I think we do have to start talking about them too. And it's a lack of fair trial. The thing is that when I talk to human rights advocates, like they are very sometimes tired to fight for fair trial, like each, and you can imagine they have enormous amount of cases, not only human rights cases, but other cases too, but still it's, the lack of fair trial also make a lot of problems for human rights advocates. Intimidation and threats, it's constantly also happening during pre-trial investigation, and also can happen in the courtroom and after this. And political cases are, I think over the past 7-8 years, there are a lot of politically, not a lot, but several politically detained human rights advocates, which is denied by the state, of course, but they're in prison for 20, 25, 28 years, so very different kind of like imprisonments. So as you see, it's pretty much a lot of challenges that human rights advocates, defenders, and the organization should definitely deal with. As I said, my time, I still have time, right? Okay, great. Yes, the case. Let's do kind of the case study. Case of resolve. I'm not sure if the participants of our today's talk, they are aware of this case. I know him, we worked together. We were part of the Young Lawyers Association. I'm part of together, as it's actually one of the examples of liquidation of human rights organization in 2013. So lately he was working on the protection of the right to adequate housing. It's a massive evictions and demolishing of the old Soviet buildings happening in Dushanbe, and not only in Dushanbe. So, and there are massive violations of the right to the adequate housing happening in Tajikistan. But unfortunately, only one organization is working on this issue, and one of the person, like activist Rizoev, he's not part of that organization, but he was working as a lawyer on protection of the right to adequate housing. What happened, he had a really big problem with one of the constructor. They wanted to evict 5 or 6 families from one of the house, and the inhabitants of that house were not agree with the conditions, with compensations. So they said kind of like, no, we don't agree. And then he was protecting their rights, and they were the company was very tied with his activism, that he wrote the complaint to the mayor of the state. Like, it was enormous amount of complaints. Yeah, in 18th of November 2020, he was detained by the prosecutor, but 5 days before he was warned to take the money and not to be too active. He refused definitely, and that was a trumped-up charge, probably called to extremist activists in the internet and mass media. So he's now in prison, and he will serve 5 years and 6 months. And as you see on my presentation, my slide, detention without any adequate and clear explanations, why and what. So, and in his conviction, it was also the connection to the banned organization Group 24. And that was not actually proved during the court hearings. So as you see, trumped-up charge is pretty much easy thing to do. His arrest was it was arbitrary detention, and his arrest, and the thing is that he was detained and there was no given external explanation why he has to be detained, why he cannot at least be house arrest, let's say. So that's why these kind of measures used pretty much often. And public call to extremist activities to carry out extremist activities, it's also have been used in a couple of other cases, which was highlighted by also Human Rights Watch in the alternative report to the Human Rights Committee in 2019. So now this article of the criminal code is actively used also for those activists who are in the mass media and who are in digital life, like writing about certain kind of aspects. So yeah, and I have thank you for your time. For listening. I hope, yeah, I think I'm good with time, and yeah, I hope that I wasn't during the short period of time to give valuable information, or yeah.
Thank you so much, Farangis. I will then hand over to our discussant, Zhao.
Thank you, Stephanie. I want to add my thank you to both the speakers. I will start with the talk given by Anja. I really liked your inputs because they are quite engaging with that colorful map on which you offer your comparative notes on the index of rule of law and transparency in 3 states in Central Asia. Because you are also quite familiar with the situations in China and those Central Asia regions, and you work on the governance aspects of those regions, I have one question concerning the relationship between economic and legal systems. As I'm working on China, I know that several studies have shown the impacts of the market economy reforms in China upon the Chinese society, in which the expanding middle class are increasingly familiar with using legal tools to defend their rights. And I wonder if any comparable trend is also observed in the Central Asian regions with the market economy reforms. The social demand on the state to provide some effective dispute resolution is also more and more visible. And for the second talk, Farah, I quite enjoyed your first-hand experiences and observations. And I'm quite sorry to hear that a lot of institutional difficulties, human rights organizations in Tajik region have to go through. And on that, I also have a question. I wonder whether those institutional hurdles are general to any type of human rights organizations, or there's any difference arising from organizations working on political rights and those on economic or social and cultural rights. And also, when you mentioned the last case on the human rights defender, Mr. Ruzov, I recall that from our last installment, the Chinese lawyer mentions that she doesn't really want to be framed or called a human rights lawyer because she just worked on criminal defense, worked on the rights of immigrant workers. That is what a lawyer do. And having that human rights advocate or human rights lawyer label sometimes just restricts her work. I wonder if this is some similar sentiment within the lawyer group in your region. Thank you. Do you want to respond now, or do you want to wait for a bit more questions to come?
I wait for more questions, but
okay. How about you, Farah?
Yeah, the same. Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Sure.
Then we will open the floor to our participating colleagues. You can just raise your hand, and I will just open the floor to you, or you could also type your question in the chat box. Any questions? Yes. Sapna, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Anja and Farang. Those two presentations were very helpful for me to also see through what's actually happening in Central Asia, because my research area is in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and what you are saying is very much resonant with what's happening in these regions as well. So in that regard, Anja, my first question is to you as to why is it that these authoritarian modes of engagements seem to gain support in Kyrgyzstan and like in other parts of Central Asia? Because as you're saying that OSCE's presence is quite visible in the area, but at the same time, it seems that in the recent few years, there seems to be more linkages and partnerships with China and Russia. And this is something that we are seeing in other parts of the world too. And as a result of which, public spaces being constrained, civil society being marginalized, so on and so forth. Then coming to Farah, your presentation on human rights defenders, and I think this is quite useful. Like your observations were quite useful for me to also contextualize what's happening in India, for instance, where the government is using laws to marginalize human rights organizations by saying that human rights organizations further international interests, and it's acting against national interests, and they also have frozen funds of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and so on and so forth. So that has pushed back lawyers and young activists to be part of these movements. And maybe connecting this with Anja's point on brain drain as to why is it that young people are not being part of political mobilization in these countries? Do you think it has something to do with the lack of social capital these groups, or liberal groups, as we would say, face in these countries? Okay, those are my questions. Thank you very much for your time.
So Anja, now you have at least 2 questions. Do you care to respond?
All right, if there are no more, I maybe can start, and also then we'll tap on the question, Chair, that you asked. Thank you very much, Sapna. You put your fingers in the wounds that I think are very openly and visible here in the region. At least I see them, even so I'm not originally from the region, Central Asia. And in short, I would absolutely agree with you. Social capital, and I would add social mobility, I think despite the fact that not only the OSCE, the European Union, the so-called international community has poured millions of euros in democracy promotion, in election observation, in building institutions, in legal reform advice. I mean, the number of missions and delegates coming from the West, helping, literally sitting here in Bishkek together with legal officers, developing laws, and providing tools and mechanisms to enhance transparency in terms of elections, competitiveness between the political parties, and so on, is tremendous. Neither China nor Russia is doing any of that. And yet, it seems that this backsliding and the way towards not only authoritarianism or strengthening authoritarian regimes, but even to autocracies, seems to be unstoppable. One way, there are many ways of answering this question, giving reasons for that, and many has been written about it. What maybe has not been written much about is this issue of social mobility. And I say this upfront because when I moved here 4 years ago, it was what a Kyrgyz colleague, an economist, by the way, told me. She said, look at this social mobility. I had no idea what it really meant, because when you're in the West, for young people, there are all sorts of opportunities. Yes, it's not always perfect, and there might be an issue also of money, but here it is essential. There is a dramatic lack of social mobility because of the level of corruption, the influence of organized crime, that even the brightest, the most educated, the most talented young people will have no chance to succeed in terms of getting a profession, a job. Therefore, this constant brain drain of the young people who would actually mobilize for change. And we've seen this in the picture about 2 years ago. Thanks to the pandemic, many young Kyrgyz people had to return to their country in Bishkek. And when the coup started after the parliamentarian election, it was these young people who normally work in Dubai, in Moscow, or in Amsterdam that were here at home. That helped as volunteers, not only during the pandemic, but also to safeguard shops, etc., etc. It's a long story. Something has already been written about it. What I'm saying here is there is a not only a dramatic brain drain, but there is a lack of a sort of what we would call is the potential for a civil society, political active civil society. Plus, what I had also underestimated when moving here is again, how not only this brain drain goes to the West, but also to the East. The number of scholarships, the number of Confucius centers by China, and they offer opportunities. Yeah, we may not like it. It may not be opportunities that people can choose. A young Kyrgyz woman told me that she had received a scholarship to study tourism in China, and she knows why, because they are expecting Chinese tourists here in Kyrgyzstan and whole Central Asia. She had no choice, but she said it was the only opportunity to do something. Yeah, and that is something that you cannot compete even with all the democratic institution building that you do, because if the people are not here who can actually trigger fair elections because they're outside, there will be no strengthening of democratic institution. So this support for authoritarian regime. Then there is another, and then I try to finish quickly. You also ask, why is there such a support for authoritarian lead? Apart from the group of people, and we're talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands of young people being abroad who have maybe a different attitude and a more liberal attitude towards things. So people that remain here in Central Asia, young people, that's a different, let's say, also a different class, maybe people who have also not the opportunities to go abroad. And they might support what they often call here a strong man, a strong leader who resolves all the issues in this very corrupt, often society. I quote here, by the way, yeah, this is what I hear from young people. And this comes back to the question that Xiao asked about the economy and the rule of law. It aligns with it. However, yes, we have seen not only in Kyrgyzstan, but also in Kazakhstan, more in Kyrgyzstan, because it's still a little bit more of a liberal society, a lot of protests by farmers, by workers, also against the way the academic development, particularly against the Belt and Road Initiative, because they are also often the treaty is between the Chinese government and the government of the countries. People are not involved. There is no participatory approach. There is no multi-stakeholder approach. There are massive investment projects, energy plans, roads, etc. in the region. You literally can see how they build it. It's, I mean, for an outsider, for a tourist, it's fantastic because you have all these wonderful roads here in the region. But on what costs? People are protesting, and they're protesting against it because there is no rule of law compliance. And what you said, Xiao, there is one thing, if you're in your own country, if the investments come from your own government and you protest them and you take this to court, for instance, when farmers here are deprived of their land, they would go to the court and try to protest or even, you know, file a claim. But here it is investment money from the outside. So the people who actually they would protest against are sitting in Beijing, to make it, to simplify it, or is sitting even in Russia, sitting somewhere else. And that makes it almost impossible here for here to link the rule of law, let's say, and economic development. I just had a student who did a master thesis exactly on this question, and compared Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and also found out that actually since the establishment of the Belt and Road, and since most of the investments come from the outside, the rule of law has declined because people have less chances even to claim their rights. I try to be very brief here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anja, for that quite helpful additional information. And now may I invite Farah to respond?
Yeah, thank you. I will answer to the first questions. You ask about the, if any types of organization, about the targeting, like GOVERN, or about the inspecting and auditing. All depends what the organization does. As you see, like now it's a programming, and the funding information now it's given to the Minister of Justice. All it's one aspect. The second is how active you are, what kind of topics you bring. So it's kind of like they do thorough investigation first, and then they target. So if you never know which organization will be targeted. So it all depends how much active and how much actively you promote sensitive topics. So that's why, and maybe it's also looking at the potential where it goes and where the money is coming from which grant maker. So it's an answer to your first question. And about another second question about the human rights advocate, kind of, let's say, labeling them. I think we use human rights advocates mostly on international arena. Let's say, when we in Tajikistan, we don't say human rights advocate, we say advocate. But we can say that this advocate works associated with the human rights organization. Because, I mean, almost all cases of the human rights cases, they're going through either the one organization or the group of organizations who have enough funds to pay the fee of the advocate. Because just last kind of addition to what I say, it's a pro bono, for example, is not well developed in Tajikistan. So that's why it's not that, okay, I have 3 hours per week to do pro bono, to protect like public interest. So this kind of culture is not yet there, but it will, I believe it will come. So this is a problem, is that we have very little number of advocates who are aware of human rights well, and they can use it in the courtroom. It's also, let's talk. So I would say, I would answer to your question this way. And question for Sapna about young people. I think it's mostly kind of the question about the young people in Tajikistan. I agree with Anja. It's you know, when it's law adopted, you fight with the consequences of application that law. And young people, of course, they're motivated, but how long the motivation can last? It's the first. The second, to get the job. It's a disaster if you are not from certain part of the country. And if you talk a little bit not that type of Tajik, for example, that is really, you can be discriminated. And the word discrimination is not yet used. Now the human rights organization started to work on the discrimination. And what is discrimination? If in the European states, you can hear discrimination, racism, oh, this and that is a whole amount of like xenophobia or the colonialism. it's not talked at all in the society. That's why kind of like the discrimination happens. Then you just tied first. Second, a social system is broken, doesn't function well, then you should take care of your parents. We should also very well understand the culture of those countries, and the cultures are sometimes different of the regions. And in India, I mean, it's a huge, and it's like really diverse. And in Tajikistan, yes, smaller, but it's still diverse. It's very different. So the perception is different. So young people try, they want, yes, and they see that the people leave and they have a better life outside, and they just go there. And exactly what Anja said, East, yes, China, South Korea, not North Korea, but South Korea, it's also a lot of young people going there as well, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. So yes, they just leave, and it's a very big unfortunate. And human rights organizations have a deficit of those people. There is not a lot of people want to work for the organizations because it's not stable. You don't know, maybe it will be closed, maybe not enough funds. What is next? Okay, you will be a lawyer, and then what? Some people want also some ambitious to grow, So yeah, I have more to say, but considering the kind of time constraint, I will stop.
Yeah, already very inspirational. And perhaps we have a bit of time for Anja to respond to the comment on the Chinese intention to expand its own regulatory order, if you want.
I was just about to type something.
Yeah, quite quickly. You can respond here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Aziz, for this question about whether China is using it. I'm just wondering how to respond it in a short way. Obviously, China never made a secret. That's a good thing about China. China never made a secret what its interests is. I think we're in terms of investment and building the infrastructure in approaching the economic markets in Europe. That's the end of the Silk Road. That's the final stop, somewhere in Rotterdam and also in Duisburg in Germany. So that's all open on the air. I think what we have, where we are struggling with, not only the observers in the West, but also here the researchers here. I have a colleague here at the OSCE Academy. She's Chinese. Hong Kong Chinese, and she is dedicating their entire time trying to understand what are the political consequences of the Belt and Road, and whether China has actually something that we in the West we would consider as a colonial approach, imperialistic approach, imposing laws, setting standards. I'm not so sure if we can assess China with the same patterns that we know from the past colonialism. When even taking the Russian colonialism here 150 years ago, even there we see different patterns. And so I'm hesitant to answer this with an easy question. This is just the same what we have seen the centuries before. However, one has to give, despite all the fact what we think about the Chinese system and the regime, and it is certainly not democratic, and it doesn't claim to promote civil society and liberal values here, etc. It never made the claim. It was very honest on that. But it is interested in stability here. And if these international laws, or what do you say, soft laws, help to create stability in Central Asia in order to expand with the Belt and Road Initiative in the Chinese interest, then yes, they export, maybe they impose laws, but I think the interest is different. It's really the stability element of the region that is up front. And maybe in generally, when we think about this globalized world and the change of regimes and the new Cold War, etc., we have to kind of loosen us a little bit from the patterns of the previous centuries and how hegemonic states acted. However, and this is now my last sentence, China is certainly not, or the Belt and Road Initiative, despite the Confucius Center, the peoples to peoples dialogues that they approach, it's not about strengthening democratic institutions or rule of law in the region. Stability can also be achieved with a different means besides rule of law. And that maybe we have to keep in mind here.
Thank you, Anja, for that good point. I think good speakers are not only about offering valuable information, but also about pushing one to think about the existing thinking pattern. With that, let me handle the floor to my colleague, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm afraid we have reached the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much for attending and also your comments and questions. And I would also like to thank our speakers for their excellent presentations. EnRoL will be back on the 4th of April. We will discuss then the role of lawyers, advocates for silenced voices. We will have with us, I'm very happy to say, the director of the Dutch lawyers organization, Lawyers for Lawyers, Sophie de Graaf. And we will also talk to one of the world's leading scholars on legal profession reform, Professor Hilary Summerland of Leeds University. With this, I would like to thank you again. Have a good afternoon and bye-bye. Hopefully to see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. See you in April. Bye-bye.
Thank you.